Yet another tutorial talking about docs, and what I'm going to show today is how to create a mini clone of docs.maxo.com. There's a lot of questions on Twitter, and I know my good friend Imo has been bugging me about it for a little bit, so we're actually going to look today at how you can create your own mini clone of docs.maxo.com based on DocFX. If you haven't checked out the previous video, you definitely should. So let's get started. So one of the first things that we do need to get is obviously the necessary components of this project. So it's all open source and free. You need GitHub. So I'm gonna launch Firefox here, and we'll go to GitHub, DND, and I have common testing. See wherever that repository is. There it is. So if I open a separate branch, so what's here is essentially everything I need to generate the documentation. So from one side, I have the docs, and this is the folder where I have all the content in Markdown format. So if you've edited any content on docs.maxo.com, you already know that it's all Markdown. So conveniently, I have Markdown content here. Very basic structure, really not a lot of complexity with this particular project. I did not intend to make it very complex, so it should be very easy to replicate if you want to. There is index.md, which is a Markdown file, empty. So I'm going to go ahead and add some content. And I'm literally going to say some content. And doesn't matter what you put in here. So just a Markdown file. I'm going to commit. All right. So I have a Markdown file. Let's look at DocFX.json. And this is the file that essentially defines what happens inside the build. So once DocFX picks up the content, it looks inside DocFX-JSON to see what is being built and where it's being placed. So in this case, I have a build element that this defines the build content. This is all the content that is essentially Markdown files, talk.yaml. Talk stands in this case for table of contents. So resource defines anything that has to deal with things like images, XML files, PDFs, anything that you want to have as a resource and not necessarily content. And destination is the output folder in the publishing repository. So that's kind of it. That's really the structure. And the toc.yaml is just a file that contains references to where my Markdown files are. This can be an arbitrary structure. You can reorganize this. The build does it automatically. There's plenty of resources to show you how to use this. So another thing in this repo is the scripts folder. So the benefit of the scripts folder is I have a build script here, and this is more of a convenience thing if kind of you think about it, but not a lot to it. I'm going to remove a bunch of testing content here that is not necessary. All right, so we're going to commit changes. All right, so what it does is because we're going to be using macOS, so we're going to be using a macOS hosted agent to build this stuff. Choice is mainly for convenience. You can use Linux, you can use Windows. Doesn't really matter. DocFX runs on all of them. I've tested it. Given that in this case, this is on macOS, so what we do first is we do brew update. So the homebrew is a package manager on macOS. And then we install the Azure CLI. So the drawback of macOS hosted agent is we do have Mono pre-installed, which is Mono allows us to execute assemblies like .NET assemblies or executables and reference .NET assemblies on macOS or Linux. And what this does essentially is installs the CLI, because while Mono is there, CLI is not. Then we have some basic debugging. It logs in with Azure with information about the app that I'm giving it. So Azure App ID, App Key, App Tenant, and we'll get to that as well. I'll show you how that works. It creates some directories that showcase how things should be organized within the folder. It downloads the latest release of DocFX, at least the latest for the time of this tutorial. It extracts it. There is a tool called unzip, which is standard for macOS. It goes to the docs folder. It executes a DocFX build, and this is done by just simply calling DocFX, so wherever we extracted it. Then it copies the content from the site folder. So if you remember back in DocFX.json, we talked about a site folder where things are being copied. So we're taking that in, and then we're just copying it inside a publish folder. Then we're copying that into Azure Storage. So we'll create an Azure Storage account as well in the web folder. So this is one of the new features with Azure Storage, that we actually support static sites now, which is amazing. So we copy that content directly in that folder for rendering. So what I'm going to do now is, well, let's go to VSTS. So because we already have all the content in GitHub, I'm going to open VSTS, and let's see, I have a test tenant that I'm using for a bunch of stuff, including hosting my blog, hosting a bunch of other Azure goodness. But I'm going to go to my experimentation project, and let's go to build and release. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new build definition that's going to publish our content to Azure. So I have my GitHub repo with content in Markdown. You can't just host Markdown. You need to convert it to HTML. So DocFX does that for you, but we need to run DocFX to generate the content. I'm going to select GitHub. So I already have it authorized with a GitHub connection. So I can just go here and do, let's see, DND, common, testing. I'm going to select this repo. I'm going to select the docs branch because this is the branch where I'm working. So if you look here, it's docs. Fantastic. So I'm going to click continue. It should be empty. I don't really need any additional stuff to go with it. It's just a DocFX project. I already have the script. I'm going to apply. Let's see. I'm going to call this DocFX test 2, obviously, or 2 if I can actually count. Arbitrary name, doesn't matter what you choose. I'm going to use macOS preview, and I'm going to save this. Now, what I need to do is just add a step. The first step is executing the bash script that I already have. So I'm going to click on this plus, and I'm going to search for bash. Easy enough. There's already a predefined task. I'm going to use that. The bash script, cool. So build content. The benefit of these names here is you can specify whatever you want, as long as it makes sense to you. I'm going to go to scripts and build.sh. So no arguments passed, not at this time at least. So we have this. I'm going to once again save. If you look back at the script that I have, there's a couple of variables defined in it, in the build script. So when we log in with Azure, we have the Azure App ID, App Key, and App Tenant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create those variables here. So we're going to go to the variables tab, and I'm going to add Azure App ID. Let's see what else is there. Azure App Key. I'm going to copy that as well. And the third one is Azure App Tenant. And I'll describe each and every one of them in a second. So we're going to add that. There's another folder that is, not folder, variable. There is a docs folder, so I'm going to copy that as well. This is the destination folder, or not destination, this is the source folder in the content repo that we're using to build the content. So in this case, it's docs, and that's coming from here. So if I go to common testing, notice the docs folder. This is where my content is, so I need to specify that as well. It's purely for convenience. It's not something that the build per se requires, but we want to make our build process scalable. So docs is there. What other variables exist that we have not defined? Azure Storage. And this is the name of the storage account where we're going to drop the files. Like I said, we support static sites now, which is amazing. We don't have a storage account yet, so I'm just going to save this as is with those variables unpopulated. So let's populate them. In this case, I'm going to go to portal.azure.com, and we're going to try logging in with my Outlook account. All right. And if this goes through, of course, 2-factors. I need to pick up my phone and get the 2-factor code. Let's see what happens. So, obviously, I'm not afraid of sharing this because it doesn't matter. 2-factor code changes. I'm going to verify it. And so once the Azure portal loads, what we need to do is create a new storage account. Azure is free in terms of a trial, so you can sign up, and I highly recommend that you do. There is so much goodness in Azure that you totally should get it. So we're gonna do create a resource, And inside create a resource, you can just type in storage, or you can see a storage here. There's a quick start tutorial, so you can just click on storage account. You can give it a descriptive name. Again, in this case, it's DocFX test 2. So this is good, resource manager. Make sure to select storage v2. So general purpose v2. For v1, we do not support static sites, so it's only for v2. So select v2. All of these options can be left as is. I already have a DocFX resource group, so I'm just gonna drop it in there. I don't really care about anything else. Default works fine. Pin to dashboard, we're gonna create it. Doesn't take that long. Once you have the storage account, you can start using it right away. The one thing I would caution though is today you still don't have access to web folders or the static site folders from Storage Explorer. So if you're using Storage Explorer, you might be disappointed to see that it does not load. That's likely going to get fixed very, very soon. So don't worry about it too much. It's going to get addressed. So it's still being created. Might take a couple more seconds until we are able to access it. That said, I'm going to go back to the build definition, and Azure Storage account is DocFX test 2. And I'm going to save it once again. It's a good idea to save, really. So we have DocFX test 2. I'm going to go to the storage account. So again, before we can start hosting sites, we need to pre-configure it. I'm going to go to static website preview, and I'm going to enable it. And index document name, again, leave it as default, because in the case of DocFX, all these files are generated, or you can specify them yourself if you want to, but it's there. And I'm going to save this. Great, we have a URL. So if I copy this URL and I go into the browser, let's see what happens. There is nothing, obviously, because we did not host anything. So we're going to hop back to the job here. So how do we push stuff to Azure? So we need 3 things: Azure App ID, Azure App Key, and App Tenant. All of those are really tied to Azure Active Directory. It's tied to an identity. Because CLI, otherwise, if you would authenticate through CLI, you need to make sure that there is a browser. Because we're running in non-interactive mode inside the build process, there is no browser. Hence, we need to deal with identity. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory. And don't worry, this tenant will get deleted right after this video. So if you see the keys that I copy and paste, you can't reuse them. You can't hack my subscription, basically because they're not going to be active. So I'm going to create a new application registration. This is going to be a new app, and I'm going to call it DocFX test. So it's going to be an app that essentially is going to be accessing content from VSTS. So I'm going to use HTTPS. Let's see, I'm going to use my blog. It doesn't really matter what is the sign-in URL, because we're just using the key to access it and log in. All right, so the application ID here is, what is the identifier? I'm going to copy it back. This is our app ID. Again, it's a good idea to keep this secret. So if you're running in production scenarios, make sure that you click the lock here, and then you'll need to pass these variables as parameters to the script. So you can't use them inside the variable section once they're secret, because that's just security measures. You don't pass secret stuff in environment variables between scripts. So either way, we have the app ID. Now we need the app key. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to click on settings, keys, and let's see. Let's give it a key and say VSTS. Again, the name should be descriptive to whatever you understand it to be good, and you can come back to it and understand why you created that key. Let it expire in 1 year. That's fine. And I'm going to save this. And once it saves, it gives us a key, so we can just copy that and bring it right back into VSTS. We have the key. Now we need the tenant, and the tenant in this case is the AAD tenant. So I'm going to go back here, Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to look at properties. So I'm going to just click here, and the directory ID is your tenant ID. I'm going to copy that, put in DocFX test, Azure App Tenant. Great. I'm going to save this. We have all the values that we need. Azure Storage, Docs folder, App Tenant, App ID, all the stuff pre-configured for us. Fantastic. What now? Well, the bad thing about the identity that we just created is it does not have any access to the subscription. So what I'm going to do is hop over to the subscription. let's see, subscription section here, and I'm gonna look for my Visual Studio Enterprise, and I'm gonna look for access control. And so notice I already have a test app configured here, so I'm gonna do add and role, let's see, probably contributor. Contributor is fine. So what I'm gonna do is find the app. I know it's DocFX, so I'm gonna type in DocFX, DocFX test, add it here, and this will give the app proper access to my subscription so that we can obviously log in through the CLI and perform actions with resources. So I'm gonna refresh this just to make sure it's all good. Here also looks pretty good. I don't think there's anything that we should change. So how about we just queue the build? macOS preview, this is fine. Build 182. So I'm gonna hop over to the build. Let's see what happens. Doesn't take that long. Any of the hosted agents, they run super quickly. And if you have the money, you can pay for more if you need to run more concurrent jobs. Obviously, while the build happens, I'm just going to say that doing all the steps I'm describing is not going to give you automatically the one-to-one mapping of what we do at docs.microsoft.com. There's a lot more infrastructure involved. We deal with things like CDN, load balancing. None of that is here. This is essentially a proof of concept of how can you deploy documentation dynamically from your GitHub repo with the same underlying tooling that we use on docs.microsoft.com, which in this case is DocFX. Open source, we're updating it. There's plenty of plugins. Also, the caveat to what I'm showing is I'm showing Markdown content. So we're not really dealing with a lot of API documentation, and that relates to things like libraries. If you have, a NPM package or a bunch of DLLs, we don't document that here, but it's certainly possible through some other plugins, and I'll get to that in some other installments. So as you can see right now, we copied everything to our storage. Build succeeded. So what now? Let's go into Azure. Let's go to our storage accounts. And let's take a look at DocFX test. And inside our blob containers, we have the web container. That is for the static site. And okay, so we see that all the stuff is created here. So everything that it generated, we had the content. So let's try and open it up. So if I refresh this, it will not work just yet. But if I do index, can't type either, HTML, and it loaded. Look, there's DocFX running in Azure Static Sites and Storage. So article, this is an article, but this gives us a static snapshot. So this is an article, how about we prove the fact that it's dynamic? Well, before we do that, we need to edit our build definition to be actually triggered from commits. So you need to rebuild it every time a commit happens. So I'm going to go to triggers. And let's see, for common testing, I'm going to enable continuous integration. Batch changes, this is fine. Pull request validation. If you're really dealing with a lot of community contributions, probably a good idea to validate pull requests. In this case, I don't really care. So I'm just going to save as is. And let's see, this is good enough. I'm not going to queue, so the build is not running. I'm going to go back to my repo, common testing. Let's see in settings, webhooks. Notice that there's a provision kind of a new webhook, which is good for push. I'm going to go back here. Let's see, let's select docs branch because this we're operating on docs. I'm going to go back to docs. So remember that this is an article, this is my index. It says, will be hosted in Azure? Could be, nothing else. I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna click on index.md. This is not it, it's actually in articles. So index.md. This is the one that I'm looking at. Let's see, this is dynamically refreshed. Good enough. So commit changes. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to go back to my build, and I'm going to click build and release, queued. Whoa, there's a build running. That's good. So DocFX test CI, DocFX test 2 is the one that I have. So this is the one that I care about. So it's currently waiting for an available agent. So we're going to wait for that to become available. I forgot to unprovision, deprovision, I think is the right word here, but deprovision another job. So we are just waiting on this concurrent limit to expire. Either way, this should give you a fully production-ready solution to host documentation. So if your organization has documentation that doesn't yet require massive scale, although massive scale would be certainly possible with Azure, it's definitely requires more work than this tutorial or the associated blog posts describe. So gotta make sure that you account for that. This one I'm actually gonna go ahead and cancel. It's pointless. Let's jump to 184, and this is the job that we care about. It's waiting for the agent, it's kicking off, and once again, it'll just rebuild the content. There's nothing happening in terms of doing anything else than other what I showed you before. And what it does, it just reloads the content in the storage account, and it will install from scratch every single time it runs. There are certain steps you can take to optimize the build. For example, brew update might not always be necessary, so you don't need to refresh all the packages all the time. But either way, technically it's a good idea, but you don't have to. As long as you can install Azure CLI successfully, that should give you a starting point. Without Azure CLI, any of the existing commands that require Azure CLI obviously will not work. Hence why it's all in the build script. Also not a good idea in my case to just keep everything lumped in together. It's a good idea to separate the concerns, but for demo purposes it works. Not production ready at that, what I'm showing you right now. There's more work involved. So let's wait for the build to finish. Looks like it's successful. It updated the content. Great. Finishing. So it looks like it finished. I'm gonna go back here and fingers crossed. If this updates, there you go. This is dynamically refreshed. So it updated it. Based on the Markdown, it re-rendered it. I still have the same content, just updated. This is it. This is kind of the tutorial that explains how to run DocFX with statically generated websites on top of Azure Storage with VSTS and GitHub. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'll be more than happy to go through the solution.